So 2 things to acknowledge before we proceed. First is that because this Shabbat has so many different layers of meaning, among them it being the first Shabbat after the election and also it being Kristallnacht, we do have 2 different main things to do together. I both have some remarks about the election, which I'm going to deliver in just a moment. And then a little later on in the service, we'll have the chance to hear a musical program from our choir in commemoration of Kristallnacht. And so I'm giving this set of instructions so that people know what to expect. I know that usually you're not used to hearing remarks so early in the service, but in order to allow both of these things to happen tonight, we thought that now would be the right time for remarks. The second thing to acknowledge is that we have a nice full house here this evening, and that some of us know each other very well, and that others of us know each other less well, and some of us don't know each other at all. And conversations about critical issues are often more comfortable with people whom we know well than they are with people whom we might not know so well. And yet, this is a critical conversation. What's going on in our country and the outcome of our election is something that people of faith, and especially Jewish people, whose faith commands us to take the world seriously, need to have, despite the fact that we don't all know each other so well. If you emailed me this week and didn't get a speedy response, it's because I spent most of Wednesday and Thursday not at my desk with my inbox, but rather in the lobby of the building and in the parking lot, talking to anyone who may have been coming through the doors or dropping off a kid in the parking lot in order to try and get a sense of where our congregation was at, emotionally, energetically, in the wake of the election. And so I feel that I've got a decently good representative sample of our people. And yet I know that the people who I spoke to don't represent everyone in the congregation. And I also know that we have some people who are friends of the congregation here tonight. All of this is to say, I'm going to share my own reflections now, and I do think that they'll speak to the needs of our community. And I know that there are some people for whom it won't speak to them, and that that's okay. Because a congregation, I think the best metaphor, is an extended family. Some people in your extended family you know very well, others you might not see all that often, but you know who they are and you care about them, even though you don't see them that much. And also in your extended family, you know that even though sometimes you might disagree with somebody, still you're going to have Thanksgiving together. Still your relationships will endure, even if you don't always see eye to eye. So I want to treat everyone in the sanctuary this evening as if we are extended family. And I'd invite you that if you see things differently than the way I'm going to present how I see them now, to please be in touch. I sincerely would love to hear from you, to listen to what I can learn from your perspective. So those are the 2 things to say before we proceed. So a few weeks ago, I reached out to a group of smart rabbinic colleagues that I'm friends with to ask them what's been the most helpful piece of analysis that they've read or listened to in the lead up to the election. And the group wrote back and suggested a variety of articles and podcasts, but 2 of the things that I received in response stood out for being recommended by several different people. The first piece that got recommended several times was a short essay by Yehuda Kurtzer. He's the co-president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And in his short essay, Yehuda Kurtzer spoke about which presidential candidate he felt would be the best choice for Israel and for the Jewish people. And if you're interested in reading his essay, you can reach out to me and I'll be happy to send you a link for what it is that he had to say. The second piece that got recommended several times by my rabbinic colleagues and friends was an audio essay by the New York Times opinion columnist Ezra Klein. And it's about that audio essay that I'd like to share a few reflections tonight. In this particular audio essay, Ezra Klein made the following argument. He said that the thing that causes some people, like me, to be so deeply bothered by Donald Trump is exactly the same thing that causes other people to be so deeply attracted to him. Namely, Klein argues, there's one central personality trait that seems to define the president-elect, one characteristic that causes him, in some circles, to be loathed, and in other circles, to be loved. And that central defining characteristic that he is so highly disinhibited, that he is so highly lacking in self-censorship. Before I continue, I should say one thing and say it very clearly. My critique this evening is not of people who voted for Donald Trump. Rather, my critique is of the president-elect himself. If anything, the election results demonstrate that those of us who voted for Vice President Harris seem to not fully understand the constellation of factors that led more than half of the electorate to cast their vote for Trump. And if Democrats want to be successful in future national elections, we would be wise to try and more earnestly understand the decision-making process that motivated those voters, rather than simply dehumanizing them. As a close friend of mine put it this week, dehumanizing the other side doesn't always lead to political violence, but all political violence begins in dehumanization. So again, my critique this evening is not of the voters, but rather of Trump himself, who, as Ezra Klein argues, is highly disinhibited. Most of us, Ezra Klein notes, approach our everyday interactions with a certain degree of self-censorship, purposefully inhibiting ourselves from saying every little thing that we think or that we feel. Of course, all of us have base and crude thoughts sometimes, but we're socialized not to speak or act on these impulses. Politicians in particular, Klein points out, are especially well practiced in the art of self-censorship. Good politicians come across as thoughtful and deliberate in everything that they say and do. Less practiced politicians we perceive as dissembling and inauthentic. But for Trump, this whole series of considerations, this process of purposefully inhibiting ourselves, seems not to apply. In fact, he seems to relish specifically in not worrying about whether he is saying the right or the polite thing. Among many of his supporters, this exactly is his appeal. It's refreshing for many of them, even exhilarating, to hear someone say out loud the things that others might think in their hearts but would never let cross their lips. Among his opponents, the effect is the exact opposite. His lack of inhibition, many of his opponents feel, ought to morally disqualify him from leadership. We find him vulgar and insulting, offensive and bigoted. And when a person who speaks and acts the way that he does is rewarded with one of the most powerful positions in the world, it not only opens the door for others to act and speak that way, it actively incentivizes people to do so. But as Ezra Klein goes on to say, President-elect Trump's lack of inhibition is no mere personality trait. Rather, it is the force that animates his policy positions. Because he is already willing to say things that other people would never say, when it comes time to shape policy, he is willing to propose ideas that others would never propose. There are far too many examples of this for me to try and name them all. A few examples. He's promised mass deportations of undocumented people. He's promised to impose restrictions on the lives of transgender people. He evidently is considering whether to issue an executive order that at a national level would ban abortion at any stage, and many other alarming policies like these. And now, this disinhibited personality is seeking to build an administration in which dissenters are actively not welcome, as meanwhile, his party wins control of all three branches of the federal government. Who, we should wonder, will be there to inhibit him? Our Jewish tradition might cause us to feel deeply concerned, not only about this kind of leadership, but also about this kind of character. Ours is a tradition that prizes the inhibiting force. Judaism is concerned with the setting of boundaries, with the defining of limits, with bringing a careful eye towards recognizing the difference between things that are kosher and things that are not. Our ancestors were well aware of our baser human instincts. And for this reason, they instructed us to avoid not only the obvious moral transgressions, you shall not steal, you shall not murder. Additionally, they instructed us to avoid even subtle kinds of shortcomings. You shall not bear a grudge. You shall not covet what isn't yours. In this way, our ancestors sought, in their own words, to build a fence around the Torah so that we might avoid even approaching the edge of moral wrongdoing, knowing full well how slippery is the slope, how easy it can be to fall right in. If this is the level of self-control that our Jewish tradition demands of ordinary citizens, how much the more so does it make these demands of anyone who would aspire to a position of leadership? In the ancient Near Eastern world in which our Jewish tradition was born, rulers were endowed with unlimited authority. A pharaoh of Egypt was no mere leader, rather, he was a god. And like a god, his powers were unlimited. Our Jewish tradition, by contrast, insisted on a different framework of authority and leadership. The Torah commands that ancient Israelite society be administered by 4 branches of government. Yes, there was a king, but also power was vested in judges, in priests, and in prophets. The prophets, in particular, were responsible for reprimanding the king when his leadership had turned foul. If the king should try to exceed the limits of his authority, imagining that he might be protected by virtue of his position, the prophet was to chastise him, to point out all the ways in which he had gone astray, and to try to convince him to return to the right path. The prophet's responsibility towards the king was, in a word, to inhibit him. It's striking to note that in the biblical passage that outlines those 4 branches of Israelite government in the ancient world, the role of the king is severely limited. For each of the other 3 branches, the Torah prescribes a list of active responsibilities, functions and tasks that each role must do. Not so for the king. For the king, the Torah is concerned only with what he may not do. We read in Deuteronomy, the king is not permitted to amass great wealth. The king is not permitted to assemble a large cavalry of horses. The king is not permitted to keep a harem of wives. The very definition of an Israelite king is to be inhibited. There is, however, one active thing that the king is commanded to do, but it's not what we likely might expect. We might imagine that the Torah tells the king that his active responsibility is to ordain laws, or that his active responsibility is to declare war and make peace, or to provide sustenance for his people. But this is not what the Torah tells him to do. Rather, this is the one and only active thing that the Torah commands for the king to do. He is commanded to sit on the royal throne all day long, to keep always by his side his own personal copy of the Torah, and to spend every waking hour of the day reading and studying the law. In this way, the king is personally responsible for ensuring that no one in the kingdom is more familiar with or has more reverence for the laws that govern their society than he does. This is the Jewish vision of leadership. Not the disinhibited personality that says whatever base things come to mind and enacts whatever laws it wants to. Rather, the Jewish vision of leadership is to practice constant restraint, to be subject to admonition, to be primarily concerned with what the leader ought not to do. This is to say, to willingly and purposefully practice being inhibited. A few months ago, a group of TBS congregants went to see the play Prayer for the French Republic on Broadway, which, if you haven't seen it, is still playing, and I highly recommend. The play takes its title from a traditional portion of the Jewish prayer book in which the Jewish community, having already prayed for our own internal well-being, now turns our attention outward and prays for the welfare of the state in which we live. The biblical prophet Jeremiah explained the purpose of the prayer like this. Jeremiah said, "You should pray for the welfare of the city in which you live, for in its well-being, you will find well-being." And indeed, for Jews here in the United States, Jeremiah's logic has largely proven true. As our country has thrived, so too have the Jewish people here thrived. But in addition to Jeremiah's logic, there are other reasons why we might want to pray for the welfare of our country. Another ancient Jewish thinker, a rabbi named Rabbi Hanina, framed Jeremiah's argument, but in the converse. Rabbi Hanina said, "Pray for the welfare of the government, for without the government, every person would swallow his neighbor whole." Rabbi Hanina was offering us a warning of what can happen when governments begin to fall apart. And so let us heed the wisdom of Rabbi Hanina. Let us offer now a prayer for this country. Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, Elohei tzetzainu. Our God and God of our ancestors, God of our children, and God of our children's children, you taught us the importance of setting boundaries. You taught us to build a fence around the Torah so that we might avoid the moral slippery slope that can lead to real wrongdoing. You taught us to expect the best from ourselves and to demand the best from our leaders. You taught us that good leaders exercise restraint. You taught us that kings should have the most reverence for the law. You taught us that when leaders turn astray, good citizens must become prophets and speak out against what is wrong. Our God, help the duly elected new leadership of this country rise to your moral standard. And when they do not, help the citizens of this country find the courage and the strength that we will need to become the prophets of our society. Help us, O God, to heed the warning of Rabbi Hanina in order that the people of this country not swallow one another whole. We offer to you this prayer for the American Republic. May it be so. Amen.